Welcome to the INFOWARS Nightly News. I'm David Knight. It's Monday, October 27th, 2014, and here are our top stories.
Tonight, a new poll shows that more Americans view the Afghan war as a mistake. Then, the nurse quarantined for Ebola concerns is a CDC employee, and the CIA denies it's intentionally withholding torture evidence. That's next on the INFOWARS Nightly News.
They rape the Muslim men while they're on drugs with high-dollar prostitutes flown in devil outfits.
Well, what does a nation without borders do with doctors without borders? That's what we've been considering over this last weekend. First, we learned on Friday that a doctor who had been treating people in West Africa returned, a doctor from the organization Doctors Without Borders. And while he was symptomatic, he traveled on the subway several times, on a taxi, went to a public area, went bowling. The public was outraged. We had mandatory quarantines enacted by some northeastern governors, and we saw another person from the same organization, Doctors Without Borders, a nurse, who was subjected to that quarantine when she tested positive. Now, that test turned out to be a false positive. Subsequent tests showed that she did not have Ebola. Nevertheless, she was outraged that she was quarantined, and she wrote an article about it in the Dallas News. Now, here's the interesting thing I think about this is they haven't focused on the fact that she worked for the CDC. Now, she says that she's scared. She says that many people might be subject to the same types of things that she was. And she said she's worried that they'll arrive and see a frenzy of disorganization, of fear, and most frighteningly, quarantine. Now, it is that disorganization that concerns all of us. And so if we're going to err, shouldn't we err on the side of caution? That's all we heard on Friday in the congressional testimony, that out of an abundance of caution, they were going to do such and such. They really didn't need to, but just to be cautious, they were going to do that. If you get confusing, contradictory readings on whether or not someone has a fever, shouldn't you, out of an abundance of caution, shouldn't you put that person into quarantine? That's what they did, but there's a lot of criticism about that. And she said this in her essay. She said, "I recalled my last night in the Ebola management team in Sierra Leone. I was called in at midnight because a 10-year-old girl was having seizures. I coaxed crushed tablets of Tylenol as an anti-seizure medicine into her mouth as her body jolted in bed. It was the hardest night of my life. I watched a young girl die in a tent away from her family." Now, hold that thought for a moment. None of us wants to see that happen to any child. We don't want to see it happen to our children in this country. That's why we have quarantines. That's why a doctor, a nurse, should understand that. They should respect that. We see a doctor coming back with that organization not respecting quarantine, going out in public, just as we saw the doctor who said, "Get your damn vaccines," go out in public, even as she was quarantined because she traveled to the country with a camera crew, one of whom got Ebola. They're not immune from getting the disease. Neither are the rest of us. The first rule of medical care should be to do no harm. The virus doesn't care if you're a hero. It doesn't care if you're a doctor. It doesn't care if you're an American or an African. We have to exercise that caution. And certainly, I'm concerned, as anyone else would be, certainly I'm concerned about the abuse that could be done with these quarantines. We've talked about that from the very beginning. We're very concerned that if this is allowed to get out of control, and we believe that may be what the CDC is up to, they are so incredibly and repetitively lax about their procedures, we're very concerned that they want this to get out in America so they can enact a medical martial law. But understand this, if you've got a SWAT team that kicks in the door of an innocent person's home, starts shooting people, throwing grenades in a baby's crib, that's not the kind of America we want to live in. But there is a role if a SWAT team is trying to rescue somebody that is in a hostage situation or in a bank robbery. We have to be able to distinguish between the legitimate use of a SWAT team and the illegitimate use of a SWAT team. In the same way, we have to be able to distinguish between the legitimate and illegitimate use of quarantine. And of course, we see this again from other doctors chiming in. We have one of the doctors who was also abroad treating people who did get Ebola say that he's worried that it's going to create a police state. He says we should view doctors the same way we view firefighters and police officers, people who are putting themselves in harm's way to make a difference. I agree with that. Let's not make the quarantine any more difficult than it has to be. Perhaps we could treat them at least as well as we do the illegal immigrants who are coming across our open borders. Put them up in very nice hotels, as they were doing with the younger children who were coming across. Nevertheless, we don't see necessarily our returning soldiers being treated that way. There have been reports of entire crews who were set apart, had their weapons taken from them, who were harassed by the TSA. Our own Staff Sergeant Joe Biggs went through horrible treatment at the hands of the TSA. They discovered gunpowder on him because he'd been blown up by a roadside bomb. And so they stuck their hands in his wounds. We don't see that kind of respect being afforded to people who have returned fighting for our government. But we need to be able to distinguish between the difference between someone who is at risk and putting the nation at risk and someone who is not putting the nation at risk. And just to underscore this, the Doctors Without Borders, the MSF as they call themselves, because it's a French organization, that's their initials, they pointed out that they've had staff members who have contracted Ebola, 13 of whom have died. So that's 54% of them in terms of a fatality rate. It's something we should be very concerned about. And as we look at the idea that people are going to be objective about their self-quarantine, I don't think we can trust it to that. I don't think we can trust a doctor like the one who was found to have Ebola and then went into the public. He was not being objective about his self-quarantine. And I don't think this nurse is being objective about it either. And when we look at what happened with Mr. Duncan, we learned this weekend on 60 Minutes that he in fact lied the first time he went to the emergency room in Dallas. We had a report on 60 Minutes with one of the nurses who had interviewed him. Here's what she had to say.
And I asked, have you been in contact with anyone who's been sick?
He said
no. He said no.
And to underscore that, if Mr. Duncan had survived, he was going to be prosecuted by both Liberian law enforcement and by Dallas law enforcement for reckless endangerment of others. The same thing they do to people who willingly and knowingly spread HIV. Now, the Wall Street Journal, I think, hit the pushback against reasonable measures taken against people who are returning from the country as the anti-hysteria. In other words, we have only fear to fear, but they take it to an entirely new level. This is what Holman Jenkins said in the Wall Street Journal. He said, the media's own anti-hysteria has come to surface. This week, a Bloomberg radio host rudely and repeatedly and uncharacteristically, he said, hushed a Wall Street analyst for suggesting that we still have things to learn about how the virus is transmitted. Guess what? That's true, he said. What's more, the virus is subject to forces of natural selection, so even our broadly reliable generalizations about transmissibility are hardly written in stone. And I would underscore the fact that at the very beginning of this, we were told that this is a different strain than they had seen before. That narrative has largely been ignored, been lost in the mainstream media. It's a strain we haven't seen before. It's a strain that is now more than 4 times the total number of people have been infected with Ebola as all of the 32 previous outbreaks combined. He goes on to say, the media, as if citing some kind of iron law, kept telling us that, to use the New York Times formulation, people infected with Ebola cannot spread the disease until they begin to display symptoms, and it cannot be spread through the air. And he says, sorry, but each clause of that sentence is subject to caveat. And the whole thought needs to be preceded with the words, government scientists believe. And who is one of those main government scientists? Well, that would be John Holdren, the guy who has pushed population control, working for Obama now. And he says, as a scientist, so we should bow before that authority. That's the argument, arguing from authority. He's a scientist, so we should just shut up and listen to him, regardless of what other scientists are saying. He says, as a scientist, he says, a travel ban is a bad idea because people might sneak around it. And he points out, but large numbers of people are sneaking around our borders anyway. They're totally open. And that's the issue. It's the open borders. That's why they want to put down the hysteria, the concern, the legitimate concern about spreading something that is so difficult to control. They want to put down that hysteria because it points out how utterly failed their open border policies are. If you're concerned about your family because our government can't even muster the courage to check to see if people coming into our country are not bringing an infection in, a virulent infection like that, if they're not allowed to look at the criminal background of people who are coming into this country? Our families are at danger from that. I believe that's one of the reasons why the Obama administration, the Democrat Party in general, is seeing a loss of support among women, because they understand that this has real consequences for us and for our families. Now, this week also marked the 13th anniversary of the Afghanistan war, and it looks like they're going to end it. That's what they're telling us, at least. We see that the BBC poll finds that 68% of Brits say that the Afghanistan war was futile. Now, listen to this. It's even worse than that. Not only do 68% of the Britons think that UK's military campaign was not worthwhile, a further 42% thought that Britain was, quote, less safe as a result of the war. Exactly. That's the point. It did not make us safer in any way, shape, or form. We see the same thing from Americans. If you look at this poll, and this is going back to February earlier this year, look at that trend, how from 2002 to 2014, look at how approval rate has dropped down into a funnel to where it was at that point in time negative. Now, what have they done? Certainly, there has been a mission accomplished. As we pointed out last week, the Afghan poppy production is at a record high. It was only 10% of the world's supply under the Taliban. Now we're at 90% of the world's supply under the U.S. military's oversight. So now we have a heroin epidemic. I guess that's really the mission accomplished. It was back in the days of Freeway Ricky Ross when we had a crack cocaine epidemic, and that was intimately tied with our foreign policy, with our wars in Central America, just as this is intimately tied in with the war in Afghanistan. Now, some interesting developments, though, as we're leaving. We're going to help them to find their way, evidently. We're going to help them find a new interest in sports. The Washington Post reports that the U.S. government is going to pay to upgrade TV sports coverage in Afghanistan, including coverage for goat hauling matches. Now, is this a boondoggle? Is this some kind of corruption? No. This is the way they are going to exercise control, the same way they exercise control on the American people. It's one of their key means of support, getting you distracted from what's going on that really matters, and then feeding you disinformation. It's exactly the same thing they do here. Listen to what they're going to do. Many U.S. taxpayers probably know they're subsidizing Afghanistan's government operations and development efforts, but it may surprise them to learn that they're paying for the war-torn nation to enter the modern era of televised sports coverage. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan issued a letter to the Secretary of State, John Kerry, this month, and he questioned spending $3.6 million to supply 3 television production trucks for Afghanistan television networks. And of course, one of the key things that they're going to be covering there is not football, but they say it's a fierce game in which teams of horse-mounted players, something kind of like polo, except that they're knocking around goat parts. It doesn't really matter what the sport is, does it? It's really the control. It's the distraction. And then, as I said, the disinformation, the same propaganda techniques that we see being used here successfully on Americans to distract them from the reality of what their government is doing to them, that's going to be used as a control technique over there. In the same way that we've seen the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe used to propagandize people in Europe, they're now going to use that technique on us. Full spectrum dominance. Now stay with us right after the break. We're going to talk about some election news. And of course, we're going to have special election coverage next week. We'll tell you all about that. And when we come back, stay with us.
I want to know what's really happening with Ebola. I want to know if there are things out there that could protect this country and protect my 3 children, just as you do. Government can't and won't protect you from Ebola. It is up to all of us to be prepared and to protect ourselves. I'm not sitting back waiting for the government to come protect me and take care of me. It's why I'm doing everything I can to boost my body's natural defenses. That's why I've got storable foods. That's why I've got my colloidal silver from InfoWarsLife.com, the silver bullet. That's why I've got nascent iodine X2 that has absolutely supercharged my personal body's defenses.